William James argues that a dogmatic, a priori ethical philosophy makes no sense. James begins by observing that all truth, whether it's scientific or ethical or any kind of truth, comes from observation. So we cannot have the final truth on anything until the final researcher has had their final say. So there can't be some ethical theory that comes before human experience. He's already suggested, for example, that psychologically any ethical theory has to account for the happiness that arises from external pleasures. It must also, however, answer the internal element that leads us to have feelings about justice and sacrifice that don't seem to be tied to the external world. With all this in place, let's get talking philosophy. In his article, The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life, William James presents his pragmatic account of ethics. He considers ethics, like any investigation, to be a human activity and so must satisfy human needs. He offers us what he takes to be a psychological component of satisfying our doubts, that ethics have to be configured to reconcile the happiness and pleasure with our inner urge for justice. James calls this the historical origins of ethics, and he notes that for most people, this psychological explanation of where ethics comes from is enough. But that's old news. See our previous episode on this article. Now we're tough-minded philosophers, and we demand more than just a simple psychological explanation, a simple historical explanation. We demand of James, and he gives us his metaphysical account. Where do ethics come from? What conditions are necessary to create ethics? First, James suggests that we imagine a world where there are no sentient beings, no one capable of consciousness, nothing that thinks about the world. And frankly, it's pretty much Earth 100 million years ago, or 400 million years ago. Any time before brains big enough to carry out this kind of activity. He says, in such a reality, would it make sense to suggest that any investigator, if only theoretical, would discover any ethical behavior? Even today, we do not expect morality to play a role in the behavior of insects or houseplants or any other living things that do not appear to have any kind of thought beyond themselves, who don't in some way or another approximate human beings. I mean, do you imagine that a moral question arises in the mind of a lion when it's eating dinner? I don't think so. Certainly, it's true that James doesn't think so. The first thing required in the universe for there to be any question of morality, any notion of right and wrong, is that there be a sentient being. Now look at that word choice very carefully. Sentient being, a being capable of self-awareness as well as awareness of the world. Now, one sentient being is not a moral universe. One sentient being is simply a moral solitude. That is a world in which there is no right and wrong. Why? Because it's just a world in which I choose what I choose. There's no one for me to have a moral obligation to. There is no one toward whom I can behave immorally. Because, again, how can we imagine having a moral obligation to something that does not have a moral obligation back, or a moral obligation that does not create a moral responsibility on somebody else? These are the kinds of problems that James says require more than one sentient being. We must have at least two. Even more, though, he's aware that we can have two sentient beings who never interact. And as a result, we still don't have a moral universe. We essentially have two moral solitudes. In order to have a real moral universe, a real world where moral decisions have to be made, where we have to consider the other when we act or behave in any way, that moral universe requires at least two beings interacting. Let's look at that again. Two beings interacting. No one being is enough to have a real moral universe, according to William James. Thus, you can't have moral truths until you have interacting sentient beings. However, according to James, one sentient being is pretty much as good as the next. There's no reason to think that one person has a better ethical intuition or ethical insight than another person. So, what James proposes then, since until that final researcher has had their final say, we can't know what ethical truth really completely closedly is. And remember, once closed, dead. Once dead, of no importance. Ethics is only important as long as there are people to be ethical, and in so long as there are people to be ethical, there are new discoveries to be made. And James, accepting this constant inflow of ideas, intuitions, inferences, arguments, James suggests then what we need to have is not a locked reality, since we can't know how to lock it, but rather a moral pluralism, an acceptance to the idea that there may be more than one way to the truth, more than one way to morality, even maybe more than one morality actually describes human behavior best. Now, at this point, James considers the possibility of a sentient being that's not human. And I'm not talking about dolphins. I'm talking about God. That he considers that a divinity might have some kind of priority in terms of ethical demands. That the demand of the divine is more powerful than the demand of a human being. The demand of something essentially eternal, more important than the demand of someone who is simply passing through a little period of time. At least he considers this as a possibility. However, we have to think back what we just said a moment ago. There is no ethical truth, there can be no meaningful moral theory without two people involved. So God is not good all by himself, or herself as the case may be. The divine needs people. And this is a whole new concept for most of us. Most of us come from some kind of Abrahamic tradition, or even if we're polytheistic, we have some notion that the divine acts without us, that we might be acting for the divine in the world, but that the idea that the divine is somehow dependent on us, well, it's a whole new thing, and it's very much part of James's outlook on God. So we're once again reminded that for James, everything is in the interaction. Nothing exists independent of the interrelationship of things in the world. Where we find truth is in that interaction. Where we find reality is in that interaction. Even God has to prove the case to us. But, and I quote James here, the only force of appeal to us, which either a living God or an abstract ideal order can wield, is found in the everlasting ruby vaults of our own human hearts as they happen to beat responsive and not irresponsive to the claim, so far as they do feel it when made by a living consciousness. It is life answering to life. God has no unique power to persuade. It is the human heart that either feels it or does not. Now let's take a moment and try to get our head around the sort of divinity James is talking about. I think the easiest way is to take a look at his discussion in the last chapter of Pragmatism. It was a series of lectures collected as a book. In that last chapter of his book, Pragmatism and Religion, he presents us with a case for a particular kind of God, a God, as I say, unlike what most of us are used to. Now, James says that in a world where there is an omnipotent deity, the whole outcome of everything is settled. Since God is all-powerful, things come out the way God wants them to happen. Now, our view on things, since we don't know what God has in mind, again, that size issue, not epistemic issue, we don't know how things are going to come out. So we take a look at the world, and some of us take a look at the world and say, look, the world is flawed, the world is imperfect, everything's going to hell in a handbasket. The outcome, regardless of what we do, is obviously going to be opposed to us. It's going to be a negative outcome. Such people are described as pessimists, and their point of view, pessimism. Now, there are other people who take a look at the world and say, look how things are getting better. Look how bright things are, how life is configured in a way to continue and respond indefinitely. The world is going to come out all for the best. And these people, he says, are optimists. But bear in mind, the optimist, the pessimist, optimism, pessimism, both follow from the idea that God is all-powerful and things will come out the way he intends. Now, what James says is if that's true, then there is no human freedom. Or if there is human freedom, it's of no importance. We're just acting within a collection of roles that we're given. It's commedia dell'arte. You go out and you play Pantaloon the father, and you can say anything you like, but at the end of the day, you're still Pantaloon the father. Yes, you can play the card game any way you like, but the outcome was pretty much settled by the deal. There's not a thing you can do about it except play the hand you're dealt, however you choose to play it. And that's meaningless freedom. It doesn't affect anything. There's nothing to it that makes any moral difference in the world. So James rejects it. James says if human behavior is to mean something, if human behavior is to have moral content, then it must be that our actions affect how things come out. And if that's true, then God is not all-powerful. And if God is not all-powerful, then God needs us. And indeed, James has already set this up in the moral argument. More than one sentient being is necessary for morality. If God wants to be good, he needs someone else. If God wants to have an outcome that can be labeled positive, he needs someone else. And he must genuinely need them. See, he genuinely needs them. Logically speaking, says James, there can be no good God without other sentient beings. Other beings who can think the way God thinks, even think differently than God thinks, but can think on their own and who make a difference in the outcome of the history of the universe. James calls this Mealy RISM, and he says that it's the only thing that makes sense, that as reality goes forward, it will take everyone's input to reach the truth, to reach reality. Remember, it's all the interaction. It is not until the last researcher has had the last say that we will know the truth about anything. That even may include God as the last researcher, but as a researcher, God has to find these things out the same as we do. And therefore, while larger in scope, in terms of time, in terms of interests, God has no priority. Epistemically, in terms of knowledge, or ethically, in terms of right and wrong. So God needs us to get the outcome God desires. So again, there can be no dogmatic, fixed, a priori, before human experience, ethical truth, says James. The truth will come when we've all lived it out, fought the fight, and hopefully come out with a conclusion that makes everyone happy. Now that's the metaphysical problem, as he calls it, an infinite perspective. Now, whether his God of infinite, limited power can really have an infinite perspective is neither here nor there. I wouldn't challenge him on whether finite human life needs to be judged on an infinite scale. These are matters for continued research, as I think James would agree. I will, however, challenge James when he suggests that the religious thinker is more prepared for the strenuous life, that is, the life of challenge, the life that faces the tough-minded view of the world, than the atheist. He sees the atheist too quickly as one who will lie down. Well, here, let me read you what he said. Our attitude toward concrete evils is entirely different in a world where we believe there are none but finite demanders from what it is in a world where we joyously face tragedy for an infinite demander's sake. Now, let me make a couple points there. One, face tragedy. He's prepared to say that our outcomes may be tragic, but we face it for the infinite demander's sake, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. That's what he's saying. And he doesn't think the atheist can do that. Now, I just don't see why. There was a time, certainly, when understanding the world for an atheist was a finite thing. The universe was a bounded place. We could see all there was to see right here in our own galaxy. We must not forget that for the longest time, our galaxy was thought to be the whole universe. And those points of light then that are the Magellanic clouds were just stars that are out there at the edge of our galaxy. Of course, it turns out there are actually other galaxies. But during James's lifetime, they didn't know that. During James's lifetime, it looked like the job of the atheist was bounded and closed. Today, it's not that way. And I submit that either point of view is one that's prepared for the strenuous life. In fact, I'll go further. I'll say the atheist, having no divine power to fall back on, no absolute which he can use to take a break from reality on, the atheist has a harder row to hoe. Well, that's it for today. Let me just repeat the whole point. James presents an interesting argument as to why ethics cannot exist before people. So there is no ethics when there are no people. Just as simple as that, if his argument holds. And I think it does. So again, that's it for today. You'll find links to the readings down below. If you have any questions or comment, please add them. I mean, the whole point of this is to elicit some conversation. If you want to support this channel on Patreon, there's a link down there for that. I'm so glad you dropped by. Hope you keep coming back. Hope you keep talking philosophy.